Our chronicles may go from one topic to the other, but most of the time we try to connect them, especially since they have some relevance to our everyday lives. And last time we spoke about the roots, our going back to the province. Perhaps this could be one kind of an enticement that we could make as far as our informal settlers are concerned, because that's exactly the problem that they discovered when they were trying to distribute logistics and relief goods and so forth. I don't know why it was discovered just now, but this has been they've been there for ages and ages, for generations, as a matter of fact. Now there is this move to be able to bring some of them back to the province if they wish. As the president himself has said, this is not compulsory, it is not obligatory, but if they wish to go back, then we are prepared to accept them. And so several provinces have already actually laid out how it is to develop themselves in the rural areas. But let's talk about what's happening here in the metropolis. Well, some time back, that was also the problem. I think when Mrs. Marcos, Imelda Romualdez Marcos, was named governor of Metro Manila, that was in the early 1980s, there was a problem she also had. Visiting Tondo, for instance, and several other informal settlers communities, they were called squatters at the time. That's exactly the problem of what she saw. They were congested. 2 or 3 families were just living in one small area, and then they did not have enough sanitation facilities and many other things. And so she looked into this and tried to find out what can be done. And so she learned how it was in certain cities abroad where you had these little houses, like for instance in the Bruges, they were all compact in one street, for instance. Actually, there were only just 2 bedrooms, for instance, or 2 rooms in these places. But they were so well arranged in such a way that it didn't seem as though we're congested. And they had all the public services and the facilities that were needed for them to live a comfortable and a decent life. So that's exactly what she did. And that's why that was the beginning of what we call the human settlements. How was this done? Well, first, in the squatter areas or in the areas of these informal communities, there was a survey conducted so that those that were already living there in that area for 10 years, a decade, or even up to 15 years, then they have already the right to be able to stay there for the rest of their lives. Those that are just transient or have been there only for 2, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, they're the ones that will have to be relocated, and that's where they have to be brought back to another area which is not exactly within the city limits. So that is how it began. As is, where is, after the survey, for those who have already lived in that place from between 10 to 15 years. In other words, meron na silang sense of entitlement. They have already lived there for quite a while, and that they are already working in certain areas. So there was really a very strict kind of a survey. They had to go over every family, every member of that family, to find out exactly where they're working, what kind of livelihood they had. If they did not have a livelihood, what were they doing there so that they can be able to survive? Maybe there is another member of the family or a parent, perhaps, who's abroad. For whatever reason, there was a census that was taken. And that is why those areas where these informal settlers or the squatters were located, if they were privately owned and the private owners could not do anything about transferring them because they would not leave, squatter nga as they would say, then the government bought that property. So they had to also design exactly how big the property was. Maybe there were several owners of several hectares where these informal communities were. So you had to talk to the private owners. The government will buy this because now it will try to do something about the people who are living there. And that is the beginning of what the human settlements is all about. So that they were now transferred to a temporary waiting area, so to say, a waiting area where they would live while that particular community where they were already living could be developed into what we now know as the bliss housing, the bagong lipunan sites and services. What does it mean? This is a new society kind of an architectural and engineering design where you had clusters of buildings that were about 5 stories each. 5 floors para, sabi nga, they don't have to use an elevator anymore. You can climb the stairs. And in each floor, in each story, you had something like 4 or 5 big rooms, actually, which could already be the homes of the people that were actually living there. So for every floor, you had something like 5 families, and they had a big enough space, one big bedroom, and then the other space would be for the kitchen and perhaps whatever else is needed. But normally it is really just for the place where they could live and where they could sleep, and the place where they could eat. And it is cleaned enough, and they had all the different requirements of living a decent life. And what are these? And that is why that began the basic services, as Mrs. Marcos would call them, the 11 basic services needed in a decent human community: water, power, food, clothing, shelter, livelihood, the kind of medical services and nutrition, sports and recreation. So they have space for this likewise. Education, they have to be either within walking distance of schoolhouses, or there could be some educational facilities that will be installed there. And likewise also for the balance of ecology, so that they do not disturb whatever existing trees there are, and they could have enough patches of the ground so that they could also have some kind of a garden in front of them, and the passageway from one bliss housing unit to another. So these were clusters of these buildings, and that was the beginning of the human settlements. Precisely the name, exactly, a settlement for human beings. Not just for them to live or sleep in, but for them to be able to create their own livelihood, to have their own facilities. And this is very important: water, power, food, and livelihood. Livelihood is also very specific as far as these human settlements are concerned. So again, there was a survey undertaken. Where are you working? Where can you work? Where can you be employed? So they were installed in certain areas where it is easy for them to have access to places of work. And likewise, within those communities, they were also given the opportunity to be able to set up their own livelihood projects. A lot of these backyard industries: how to make soap, how to make candle, how to make mats, how to make bags. Remember how it was that even Pasig Rivers, all the water lilies of Pasig River were harvested, dried up, and used to make mats and bags, and all of this, anything that can be utilized. And even this program that Mrs. Marcos also had, May Pera sa Basura. So even the segregation of garbage, for instance, could be utilized, so that the kind of garbage that could be converted into fertilizer was also part of the livelihood program. Many other things besides. And so there it goes. There was also the training of the National Manpower and Youth Center, which is now the TESDA, where the men were actually trained for certain skills and certain crafts. They could be plumbers, they could be electricians, they could be mechanics, they could be furniture makers, they could be whatever it is that their hands could be able to do. They were trained to do this, so that by themselves they can also be doing their own livelihood. So they could be hired, and there were advertisements for this around the community. Maybe the next village was a gated village, and so they could advertise, well, across the street where the squatters used to live, and it is now a human settlements area. You have plumbers, you have carpenters, you have furniture makers, you have people who could fix your doors and whatever it is that you need fixing. So there you have it, and that was the beginning of the human settlements. And that is why we speak about this, because now is the time to be able to understand how it was done several decades ago, but it still can be done. Do we still have enough space in the metropolis? As I've said, those that are already outside of the census of having lived in that place for 10 to 15 years, they could be relocated. That's why you had the Dagatan project, where people were relocated in that place. You had, for instance, the Dasmariñas project, and several other locations, a little bit, because now you have mass transport coming to and from these provinces beside the metropolis. So they could already be relocated there, and that is exactly the same kind of human settlements that is also installed in those places. So we bring this back in such a manner so that many things that were done in the past could still be done today. And perhaps by looking into several of these colonies, as you would call it, where you have people still living in the most congested areas, you could sort this out. Like, for instance, just here in San Juan, you had the biggest Madrigal estate just at the back of our yard. And that is where that was bought by the government, and now it was installed into something like, well, you have an arena, but adjacent to that, they still haven't reconstructed the entire, well, I don't know how you call this, part of the Corazon de Jesus barangay. But that's exactly what we're talking about. Mayors, especially the barangays, these are the local government officials, they could look into this now, especially that they're out there in the streets helping the government distribute relief goods and logistics for the support of our people. Then they could also take into consideration what can be done for these congested areas. Can they be relocated? Can they actually be set in such a way that wherever they're located, you could build already this kind of a bliss housing for them to live in, so that they will no longer be so much crowded as far as the way it is now. Time was when we were even suggesting that in these congested rooms that they are living in, they could just put a divider. All the boys in one side, boys and men on one side, you have a divider, and all the girls and the baby and the women on the other side, so that they don't intermix when they're sleeping. That's where you prevent teenage pregnancies, and that's where you prevent incest. And also you prevent a lot of domestic problems, just in case there are several families also living in that congested place. But that can be also solved by being able to look into the situation as it is now. This is not just looking back. This is getting the lessons and how it was done in the past. So that now that we're having problems with congestion in these communities, we could set up already right now, or perhaps yesterday, areas where we can actually build homes for them, as the President Rodrigo Roa Duterte himself has said, to give every Filipino a life that is decent and dignified.